Chicago, 1886. The city was a furnace of progress, a sprawling industrial beast that devoured iron, coal, and human sweat. The skyline was jagged with smokestacks, their black plumes rising into a sky that never seemed to clear. The streets pulsed with streetcars and horse-drawn wagons, but the true engine of Chicago was the labor of its people. Tens of thousands of men and women crowded into the factories, mills, and stockyards, their bodies bent by hours of relentless toil. They worked 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that barely fed their families. Children, no older than 10, shouldered burdens heavier than their small bodies could carry, their eyes dulled by exhaustion. Chicago was the promise of the American industrial future, but for its workers, it was a future that came at the cost of their lives. Amid this misery, a cry began to spread. It started quietly, in union halls and radical newspapers, but it gained power with every retelling. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. The slogan was simple, almost poetic, but beneath it lay a revolution. To the working class, the demand for an 8-hour day was not just about shorter hours. It was about dignity, survival, and freedom. To factory owners, it was a threat to their profits, an audacious challenge to the order of society. The line had been drawn. On May 1, 1886, that demand erupted into the streets. Across the nation, nearly 500,000 workers joined in a strike unprecedented in American history. In Chicago alone, about 40,000 men and women abandoned their posts and marched through the city. Banners waved above their heads, white muslin painted with slogans of solidarity and freedom. Brass bands played, voices rose in chants, and for a moment, the workers felt the intoxicating thrill of their own power. For once, they were not silent cogs in the industrial machine. They were a force, united and loud, demanding to be heard. But the reaction from the other side was swift. The city's newspapers branded the strike a foreign conspiracy, the work of anarchists and communists seeking to destroy America from within. Chicago's business elite panicked, seeing their fortunes endangered by what they called mob rule. The police, who often acted less as keepers of the peace and more as soldiers for the wealthy, were mobilized in force. They carried rifles, batons, and the quiet license to use them. Meanwhile, private security forces, like the notorious Pinkerton detectives, lingered in the shadows, ready to break strikes with fists and bullets. The city was braced for confrontation. For 2 tense days, the strikes continued. Families filled the streets, children clinging to their mothers' skirts as speeches thundered from corners and wagons. The city seemed to teeter on the edge of something immense, a new era of labor rights or a violent crackdown. On May 3, the balance broke. Outside the McCormick Reaper Works, one of Chicago's largest factories, hundreds of striking workers gathered to confront the strikebreakers who had been brought in to replace them. Their anger boiled, fueled by weeks of hunger and the smug defiance of men who crossed the picket lines. The police, already on edge, moved in with batons raised. Stones flew from the workers' hands, shouts turned into a roar, and then the shots came. Rifles cracked in a staccato burst, echoing against the walls of the factory. Workers dropped where they stood, blood spilling into the dirt road. Some fled, stumbling in panic, while others stayed behind, their rage overtaken by disbelief. When the smoke cleared, at least 2 lay dead, with many more wounded. The McCormick Massacre, as some would call it, was more than just a clash, it was a message from the authorities. The cost of demanding dignity would be paid in blood. That evening, the leaders of the labor movement convened in urgent fury. They were men of different stripes, some anarchists, some socialists, some pragmatic unionists. But in that moment they were united by grief and outrage. The workers had been slaughtered for daring to ask for a fair day's work. Something had to be done. Handbills were printed and scattered across the city, calling for a mass meeting the following evening at Haymarket Square. The leaflet's words were stark, almost prophetic: "Workingmen, to arms." Though not everyone who attended would take that literally, the cry carried with it a desperate resolve. The following day dawned gray, the city cloaked in drizzle that seemed to blur its edges. Haymarket Square, an open-air marketplace, was chosen as the site for the gathering. It was a familiar place for working people, a space where voices could rise above the clatter of wagons and the hum of the city. By evening, workers began to filter in. They came in their worn coats, their boots caked with mud from factory floors, their faces marked by fatigue and hope. On a wooden wagon, speakers climbed up to address the crowd. The speeches were fiery, but they were not calls for chaos. August Spies, a German-born labor activist and editor, spoke passionately about the violence at McCormick and the plight of the working class. Albert Parsons, another leader, urged the crowd to remain steadfast but peaceful, to show that the workers' cause was just. Rain drizzled onto the crowd, but they listened, rapt, their hearts stirred by the thought that perhaps history was shifting beneath their feet. The mayor of Chicago himself, Carter Harrison, attended briefly, walking among the workers and listening to the speeches. He judged the gathering orderly, not dangerous, and later testified that he saw no need for police intervention. But the police did not agree. They had been primed for confrontation, and their superiors would not let the night pass without a show of force. As darkness fell, a column of nearly 200 armed officers prepared to march on the square. Their boots struck the cobblestones in unison, rifles glinting in the weak lamplight. In the square, the speeches drew toward their end. The crowd had thinned with the rain, some going home to their families, others lingering in clusters. The workers were tired, but their spirits were strangely lifted. They had gathered, spoken, remembered the dead, and in that moment, they felt united. But as the line of policemen approached, the atmosphere shifted. The clatter of rifles, the grim faces of authority, the sudden bark of orders. It was clear that peace would not be allowed to last. None of them knew then that history stood on the edge of a knife. That within minutes, Haymarket Square would be bathed in fire, screams, and blood. That a single act, still shrouded in mystery, would ignite a storm that would haunt the labor movement for generations. For now, they were only men and women holding on to hope in the drizzle, unaware that the night was about to shatter into violence, and that the name Haymarket would be burned forever into the memory of labor's struggle. May 4, 1886. The drizzle had not lifted from Chicago. The air hung damp and heavy, clinging to the brick facades of warehouses and the mud-packed streets. By evening, Haymarket Square flickered with the glow of gas lamps, their light catching in puddles that mirrored the gathering crowd. The workers came slowly, in twos and threes, until they formed a small sea of faces, their breath rising white in the cool night. Some held umbrellas, others simply pulled their caps low against the mist. They had come to listen, to grieve, to stand together after the bloodshed at McCormick. On the makeshift stage, a wooden wagon parked near the square's center, labor leaders climbed one by one, their voices echoing through the damp air. August Spies, fiery and sharp-eyed, spoke first. He railed against the violence of the police, against the machinery of greed that crushed workers beneath its wheels. His German accent carried across the square, his words laced with anger but also with resolve. Albert Parsons followed, eloquent and steady, urging unity without recklessness. Others added their voices, weaving together a tapestry of protest and sorrow. The crowd listened quietly. This was not a mob baying for chaos. It was a gathering of men and women, tired and wet, but unwilling to bend under the weight of fear. Even Chicago's mayor, Carter Harrison, wandered through the assembly earlier that evening. He had watched, listened, and departed satisfied. In his view, there was no danger here. No riot. No insurrection. Just citizens exercising their right to speak. But beyond the square, the city's police force was already moving. A column of nearly 200 officers assembled, rifles slung across their shoulders, batons at their belts. Their commanders had no patience for nuance. To them, every speech was sedition, every worker a potential assassin. As the evening wore on and the crowd began to thin, the police marched toward Haymarket, their boots hammering against cobblestone in grim unison. It was nearly 10 o'clock when they reached the square. On the wagon, Samuel Fielden, a stonemason and labor activist, was finishing his address. His voice was hoarse, straining against the drizzle, when the police captain barked an order, "Disperse at once." The words had barely faded when history broke apart. No one saw the hand that threw it. Perhaps it came from the crowd, perhaps from the shadows, perhaps from a figure fleeing into the night. But the object, a crude, homemade bomb, arched through the air and landed in the line of advancing police. A blinding flash split the darkness. The explosion cracked like thunder, spraying metal and fire. Men fell, torn apart by the blast. Panic seized the square. In the chaos that followed, discipline shattered. Police opened fire wildly, bullets slicing into the crowd. Workers screamed, ducked, ran. Some fell in the mud, blood pooling beneath them. Others were shot in the back as they fled into the alleys. Horses reared and bolted, wagons overturned, and the square became a nightmare of smoke, shouting, and gunfire. No one knew who was shooting at whom. Some policemen likely fell to their own comrades' bullets, but amid the frenzy there was no distinction between guilty and innocent. Everyone was a target. When the smoke thinned and the gunfire ceased, the horror revealed itself. 7 policemen were dead, some ripped apart by the bomb, others struck down by friendly fire. At least 4 workers lay lifeless in the square, though witnesses whispered the toll was higher, with bodies carried away under cover of night. Dozens more were wounded, some maimed beyond recognition. The cobblestones of Haymarket glistened with blood, washed into rivulets by the rain. Chicago awoke the next morning in shock, but the narrative was decided almost instantly. Newspapers screamed of an anarchist conspiracy. Illustrations showed shadowy foreign radicals hurling bombs into innocent policemen. Headlines called for vengeance, for justice, for the eradication of the labor movement. The fact that no one knew who had thrown the bomb, or whether the labor leaders had any connection, mattered little. Fear was more powerful than truth. Within hours, police swept through the city, raiding union halls, breaking down doors, hauling men from their homes in the dead of night. German immigrants, socialists, anarchists, anyone who had spoken too loudly about the 8-hour day, were branded traitors. The dragnet settled on 8 men: August Spies, Albert Parsons, Samuel Fielden, Michael Schwab, George Engel, Adolf Fischer, Louis Ling, and Oscar Neebe. Some had not even been present at the square when the bomb exploded. But they were leaders, and leaders would pay. Their trial was a spectacle, less about justice than about silencing a movement. The prosecution never proved who had thrown the bomb. Instead, they argued that the defendants' words, their fiery speeches, their printed pamphlets, had inspired violence. Words, they claimed, were as deadly as explosives. The jury, composed largely of men hostile to labor, agreed. Guilty verdicts were delivered swiftly. 7 of the 8 were sentenced to death. 1 received 15 years in prison. The condemned awaited their fate in iron cells. Appeals failed. The city prepared the gallows. On November 11, 1887, 4 of them were led to execution: Spies, Parsons, Engel, and Fisher. Before the trapdoor opened, Spies shouted defiantly, his voice carrying to the spectators, "The time will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today." Moments later, the rope snapped taut, and silence fell. Louis Ling, defiant to the end, escaped the hangman's noose by smuggling a dynamite cap into his cell and ending his own life in an explosion that echoed through the prison walls. The others, Schwab, Fielden, and Neebe, had their sentences commuted, but their lives were scarred, their names forever tied to Haymarket. For the labor movement, the trial was a wound that never closed. Around the world, the executed became martyrs, their images carried on banners in marches from London to Havana to Tokyo. But in America, their names were smeared with infamy, erased from the polite version of history. The Haymarket affair, as it came to be called, left behind questions that still linger. Who threw the bomb? Was it truly a worker, or an agent provocateur sent to justify a crackdown? The truth remains buried beneath fear, propaganda, and silence. What is certain is this: the massacre at Haymarket broke the spine of the 8-hour day movement, for a time. Leaders were dead, unions scattered, fear stalking every meeting. But it also planted a seed. Across the world, May 1st was chosen as International Workers' Day, a tribute to the martyrs of Haymarket. In the United States, though, that legacy was deliberately obscured. Politicians and business leaders recoiled from the radicalism of May Day, and they would soon craft a different holiday, in a different month, to honor labor, one stripped of bombs and gallows, a safer story for a dangerous history. The smoke of Haymarket lingered long after the square was cleared, its echoes settling like ash over Chicago and the nation. For the wealthy and powerful, the bombing was proof that labor unrest was a threat to American stability, a contagion of anarchism imported from foreign agitators. For workers, it was a scar, a moment when their cries for dignity were met not with dialogue but with bullets, trials, and the gallows. Haymarket became less an event than a symbol, dark and contested, its meaning shaped by whoever told the story. The newspapers spoke one language: condemnation. They printed grotesque caricatures of wild-eyed radicals with bombs in their hands, stoking fear among middle-class readers who already viewed immigrants and unions with suspicion. Employers seized the moment to weaken organized labor, firing suspected sympathizers, blacklisting activists, and demanding loyalty oaths from workers desperate to keep their jobs. In the short term, the 8-hour-day movement faltered, its leaders silenced or scattered. But the memory of Haymarket did not vanish. Instead, it traveled, crossing oceans, seeding itself in movements abroad, and finding new life in the hearts of workers who would not forget. In London, Paris, and Berlin, labor leaders invoked the Haymarket Martyrs as proof of capitalist brutality. They held rallies on May 1, 1890, marking it as International Workers' Day, a holiday of resistance and solidarity. Across Europe and beyond, May Day grew into a tradition, a day of marches, speeches, red flags, and collective defiance. The demand for 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will, became a chant that leapt borders and languages, as much a moral cry as a political one. But, in the United States, the story took a different path. Haymarket was too raw, too dangerous, too soaked in blood for the nation's leaders to embrace. To sanctify May Day as a holiday would have been to honor men branded as anarchists, to elevate a moment of violence into a national myth. Business leaders and politicians recoiled from the idea. Instead, they sought a way to honor labor without legitimizing radicalism, to give workers a holiday that celebrated productivity while burying the specter of rebellion. The opportunity came less than a decade later, in 1894. That summer, another great strike erupted, the Pullman strike, led by the American Railway Union under Eugene V. Debs. Workers in the company town of Pullman, just outside Chicago, had seen their wages slashed even as their rents, owed to the company itself, remained fixed. Their desperation ignited a strike that spread like wildfire across the nation's railroads. By June, nearly 250,000 workers had walked out, halting freight and passenger trains in 27 states. The nation's arteries of commerce seized up. Railroad executives, outraged, called upon the federal government for intervention. President Grover Cleveland obliged. He sent federal troops into Chicago, and when soldiers with bayonets clashed with striking workers, the streets ran red again. Train cars were torched, gunfire erupted, and chaos engulfed the city. By the time the violence subsided, at least 25 workers were dead, many more wounded. Public opinion wavered uneasily. Sympathy for workers clashed with fear of disorder. Cleveland, already deeply unpopular, sought a way to mend the political wound. He moved quickly. Within days of the strike's collapse, Congress rushed through legislation creating a new national holiday, Labor Day. It was to be celebrated not in May, but in September, chosen in part because unions had already marked that month with parades and gatherings. On June 28, 1894, Cleveland signed the bill into law, less than a week after the blood of the Pullman dead had dried on Chicago's streets. It was a gesture of conciliation, a balm to soothe anger, a promise that the nation did, in fact, honor its workers, so long as they honored their place within the system. Labor Day was born not from celebration, but from crisis and fear. It was a holiday designed as much to contain the labor movement as to celebrate it, a safer substitute for May Day. In September, Americans would march in orderly parades, their banners praising industry, not revolution. Families would gather in parks, listen to speeches, and picnic beneath the late summer sun. Over time, the parades gave way to barbecues, and the speeches to retail sales. The holiday drifted from its origins, its true roots fading from collective memory. Yet the ghosts of Haymarket never truly disappeared. Even as the official narrative turned Labor Day into a bland civic ritual, whispers of the martyrs persisted. In Chicago, a monument was raised over the graves of the executed, where mourners gathered each year to lay flowers. Internationally, May Day continued to swell in importance, embraced by laborers and radicals, communists and socialists, even reformers who wanted nothing more than fairness at work. For them, Haymarket was not an embarrassment to be forgotten but a touchstone, a reminder of the price paid for progress. And in time, even the 8-hour day, the very demand that had sparked the strikes of 1886, became reality. It came slowly, won through decades of agitation, strikes, and political battles. By the early 20th century, some industries adopted it, and in 1938, with the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, the 8-hour day and 40-hour workweek became law across the United States. What had once seemed radical, dangerous, even seditious, was now the standard. It had been bought with blood, with the lives of men and women whose names most Americans no longer remembered. Today, Labor Day is a weekend of parades, cookouts, and the symbolic end of summer. Few who enjoy its respite think of Haymarket Square, of the bomb that exploded in the rain, of the shouts and gunfire, or the gallows where 4 men met their end. Few connect the quiet of a Monday holiday to the roar of workers who once shouted, 8 hours for what we will. Yet beneath every hot dog, every parade float, every day off the clock, lies that hidden history. The silence August's spies promised as the noose tightened around his neck has, in its way, endured. It lingers each September, whether or not we recognize it. The massacre that created Labor Day was not the neatly packaged story politicians prefer. It was a story of violence, repression, and sacrifice. It was a story of workers who dared to demand their humanity in a world that saw them only as parts of a machine. It is a story still relevant, as questions of work, wages, and dignity echo into the present. Labor Day may not have been born on May 1st, but it was born in the same fire, in the same struggle, in the same yearning for justice that filled the air of Chicago in 1886. And perhaps, if we listen closely, the silence of the martyrs still speaks, more powerful, just as they promised, than the voices that once tried to strangle it. If this story gripped you, like, comment, and subscribe, so you never miss the dark chapters of history we uncover next.